I'm going to check now, and then we'll be able to conversate.
Okay, your sound is very, very blurred and distracted.
Hi, Mary.
Hello, how are you doing?
Great, thank you so much, and thank you for coming on to have this discussion with me. I think it's obviously a very important one, and you've been doing some really amazing work on it, so thank you very much for coming.
Thanks, Mbali. Nice to be here this morning, even though the wind is howling outside.
I'm just going to say hello to everyone else that's watching, and just thank them for obviously being with us on this conversation. And I just think really at the start, what I want to say is that obviously I'm aware that no leader is able to make policy on their own, but I do think it's important that we really, as candidates, particularly show what our offerings are and where we think the party could concentrate on a lot. And for me, the climate change issue and the ecological crisis we have in South Africa is not something that's theoretical. It's something that I've seen and that I feel very strongly about. I worked in Mkanyagute for a very long time, which is one of the most rural parts of our country. And the devastation that has happened there because of partly the drought, but many of the factors that have actually been man-made and governments-made have just exacerbated to me the fact that when we don't deal with this particular crisis in the urgent manner that is required, we are actually going to be punishing the people in our society that are most vulnerable, because they will be the most affected and the first hit by what we're seeing. And I think that we've seen with the day zero crisis that we had in Cape Town, that this is not something that we can any longer pretend is not a very urgent crisis that we need to be addressing. I'm not convinced that we are doing as much as we can in terms of our government. And I don't think that we are having these conversations in the kind of way that not just is about policy making in the party, but is really about informing the public so that they can go with us as we try to champion some of these issues. So this is why I'm having this conversation first. I think that over the next few weeks, I'll be having a number of them: land, agriculture, what we do about traditional leadership, where we stand on the economy. But at the very basis of it is that none of those particular topics will be important if we can't even have the environment to live in and to sustain. So I'm going to just start by introducing you formally, Professor Scholes. Professor Scholes is a full professor at the University of Witwatersrand. She's in the School of Animal, Plant and Environmental Sciences, where she holds the research chair in applied systems analysis. She and her husband, Bob Scholes, who's also very well known in this field, are literally a power climate couple, in that they have been responsible for some of the most important work on this particular field in our country. And Professor Scholes' record is incredibly extensive. She's mentored over 70 postgraduate students. She teaches at a postgraduate level at the university, and has been the recipient of the Vice Chancellor's Award for teaching, as well as being a member of the Royal Society of South Africa, the South African Academy of Science, the African Academy of Sciences, and also is a member of the Royal Swedish Academy in agriculture and forestry. And there's a very long list of accomplishments that she's had here, but I think just so everybody knows, we're speaking to somebody who is literally at the forefront of this particular issue. And I obviously asked her to join me so that we could get the experts' advice. And this is what I would want to do as dear leader, is to really bring people who are at the forefront of all issues to help guide the party in the best way possible to dealing with some of the issues in South Africa. Professor Scholes, thank you. Do you think you could maybe just start off by telling us a little bit about your work and what do you do and why the passion for this particular subject?
So thank you very much. So I'm a Vara South African. I'm born and bred in South African my father was a miner and my mother was a nurse. So we grew up in relatively poor circumstances, but we've been able to achieve by being well educated, thanks to my parents' sacrifice, but also by recognizing that we can stay in South Africa and make a contribution to society rather than leaving the country and growing our reputation internationally. So myself and my husband have been here essentially forever. And we have a 23-year-old son who's a physicist and just finishing his master's degree. So we really are a committed family to looking at sustainable development. So I started my career at WITS, and I studied in the postgraduate level in doing plant physiology, which had a very realistic bias at that time, because I was looking at the quality and the quantity of wheat that was produced in the Free State, and were the farmers being adequately compensated, and who back in those days was actually controlling agricultural production. So we looked at that, and we used to have all those old boards about wheat boards and maize boards and dairy boards. You're probably far too young to understand that during that legacy, everything was completely controlled by the government in terms of cost and quantities, etc. So I did that for my PhD. And then after some time, I realized that I couldn't only work on the plant had to grow somewhere, and it grew in soil. And so I then went, together with my husband, we went to North America to do postdoctoral studies in soil science, because that was, we felt at that stage of our careers, a limitation to understanding actually how sustainable development, what pathways it can go on. And then we spent some time in South America, particularly in Peru, looking at the development of rice production and new technologies for rice production. Came back to South Africa, worked here some more, then realized that the plant actually grows in soil. I now sorted that out, but the leaves are in the atmosphere. So I then went back to America and did another degree in atmospheric chemistry in Colorado. So then I thought, okay, now I actually understand the soil bit, where the roots are, the plant bit, and the leaves wander around in, the air. So now let me try and put this together in a system. And so that's what I've been doing for a number of years, both teaching at WITS and in other places, looking at how the system works. So I'm not particularly good at understanding one leaf on a plant or one plant in an ecosystem, but I am much better at trying to understand how the bits of the system work together. So that's where we've become really interested in global change, because we used to call it climate change. And actually, it's gone way beyond just a climate issue. The climate is quite narrowly defined sometimes by people in terms of it only being temperature or being rainfall, and people focusing on temperature and rainfall. And if they don't see dramatic changes in those two things, then they say, but we're not impacted by climate change. What's this big fuss about, Then we say, no, but you may be impacted because the amount of maize that we've produced last year wasn't enough to feed the country. So we've had to import maize. So therefore the price of mielie meal has gone up. So whilst you may not have been personally impacted by rainfall distribution, you certainly have been impacted by the price that you then had to pay for your mielie meal. So we've got a good feeling these days on what we call global change, which involves everything we see around us in terms of nature, but also the direct impact on people and society.
I really love that. And I think that that's exactly what people think, is that when they don't feel that, the drastic rises or decreases in temperature, or if they haven't physically seen some form of evidence of global change, they think that it's not something that's immediate and important. And I know certainly some people I've spoken to think with the myriad of issues that South Africa has, this is not the one to focus on. And I think they couldn't be more wrong. And I think the example that you use now the increasing price of mealie meals is a really great one. And I wonder, just because you work in systems and you've obviously done extensive research, if you could just expand a little bit on what other ways is this change really affecting the lives of ordinary South Africans? Obviously, as somebody who will have a platform to be able to speak, it would be helpful for me to even be able to draw some examples when I explain to people, to not use big jargon or terminology that is going to be foreign to them, to really drill down into how this affects them so that they can understand.
So I think people do understand temperature and rainfall distribution, but actually often only how it impacts them. Like they've had to put on another jersey, or they've spent more money on fuel wood this month because it was colder. So there are very localized impacts of those two things, which we mustn't underrate, because it changes the well-being of people in their homes. And many of our homes, especially some of the newly built RDP homes, haven't actually been built with sufficient insulation, both in the ceiling or in the windows, the window frames. Some of them don't even have a ceiling. So we've done a study in the Isimeleni township outside Wakkerstroom and Mpumalanga, where it gets very cold in winter, like very cold. This year we had -17. And those people are in these nice little homes, and they're very pleased to be in that nice little home, but they're freezing because it hasn't been well insulated. In fact, they don't have a ceiling at all, and the walls aren't plastered and things like that. So we understand why those things haven't happened, but those will impact people directly. So they might not know the trends of the rainfall. They will understand it from folklore that their granny remembered that it was very cold such and such a time. But, from day to day, you don't really understand those temperature changes, the climate changes, unless they do impact you directly. So where we will have big impacts will be on the impacts on yield of all our cereal crops. So maize overall in the country will go down unless we find new areas to grow it in, because the rainfall is going down and maize needs 630 millimeters of rainfall to give a good yield. And the areas in the Free State at the moment that produce 34% of our maize is sitting between 625 and 635 millimeters of rainfall. So if it just goes down by another 5 millimeters of rain, so in other words, one less rainstorm a year in the Free State will mean in certain areas of the Eastern Free State, we won't be able to grow maize any longer. So there's those impacts, directly on yield, directly on the types of crops people will plant, and they will be moving towards more drought-resistant plants. So, that's looking at the plants. I can tell the same kinds of stories about livestock agriculture, but perhaps you'd like to keep me from going off track.
Yeah, it's just really fascinating. It's really interesting. I think it makes it much more relatable to understand it in some of the terms that you're speaking on. So I suppose the next question then is, what are we supposed to do about this? South Africa is a signatory to the Paris Agreement, which has its own sort of criteria, but what, in your view, needs to be the most urgent thing that we need to do? And again, I speak for myself as somebody who hopefully will be able to put these on a platform that could have the people that can make these decisions be able to change them. But what do we do as ordinary South Africans, and then what do we need to do as a country to try and mitigate some of these issues? And I know it's hard for you to probably drill down into one or two things, but just what you think is the most important or the most critical at this point that we do.
So I think, as you point out correctly, we have made our commitments to the IPCC documents and to the Paris Convention. And I think we have to start showing goodwill about trying to meet those, the decline in CO2 production in our country that we did promise. So we do know globally that it is the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere that is causing the temperature to rise.
Yeah.
So, just to understand that, think about it as you've got a nice duvet with feathers in it, and when you sleep under it, you stay nice and warm. But now let's pretend those feathers are carbon dioxide. So instead of having one layer of feathers, somebody puts 5 duvets on your bed, and you're now super hot, okay? Because you can't get rid of that heat because the feathers capture it. Okay.
Yeah.
You see, so that's what's happening with if we put more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And South Africa is particularly bad at putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere because of industry and because of using fossil fuel power stations. But South Africa, on the other side, is particularly good at making international policy and telling the world that we're going to do it, but we don't. So that's the big disconnect. And, so in South Africa, for me, the critical areas in the next 20 years are going to be energy, food, and water and education. Those are the areas that will build our economy, but at the same time, we need to make them sustainable.
And I think, I've been doing some reading, and South Africa is the 14th biggest emitter of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, as well as the fact that we are actually warming at twice the global average. I don't see us being able to meet some of the criteria in the Paris Agreement, or at least we haven't seen that happening so far. As you say, we don't have the will per se. And I think it's going to be very interesting because, as I say, where I've worked in places in KZN and places like Ugu on the South Coast, you can see that some of this does have to do with forces that are beyond our control in terms of the climate, but a lot of it is also being exacerbated by our own inability as governments to really wrestle and grapple with the issue and to stop it, as it were. But there's a lot that's being made out of carbon emissions, and I think the conversation in South Africa is also around fossil fuels and renewable energy, particularly because you're obviously being load shed all the time, and that's something that people can directly see. Is this conversation broad enough in the South African context? Should we not be talking about more than just the fact that we don't have power or that we're so reliant on coal and fossil fuels? Are we having a big enough conversation on what these renewable energy sources can be? I mean, I know that we're speaking a lot right now about independent power producers because of the Eskom issue, but it still feels to me that there's a lot more going on that we aren't really discussing. I don't know if you have any just thoughts on that.
So the fossil fuel industry in South Africa is a problem. And it's actually quite tightly controlled by not many individuals. And there are lots and lots of knock-on effects. So, for example, we should say, all right, we know the name of the company that owns most of the power stations, but then they have contracts with truck drivers. And many of those truck drivers are completely tied up in cartels and are adding and making the situation much worse. So for example, last week during load shedding, I especially drove down to the Majuba power station, which is outside Volksrust in Mpumalanga. And there were 400 coal trucks with 400 drivers standing on a 5-kilometer stretch of road to deliver coal, because it was one of the very few power stations in the country. And then you wonder why there's load shedding when there's 500 trucks parked on the side of the road, because they can't deliver the coal because there's no capacity. And then that has completely made our railway system useless, we should be delivering coal by railway. All the power stations have what's called a spur line associated with them. So it goes straight from the colliery, where it's mined, to the power station, but on a railway line, not on a truck. But because the truck drivers dominate the distribution of the coal, it damages our roads. And the rail industry has gone into a complete derelict state. So by having fossil fuel power stations, it's causing a lot of other problems in society, as well as the CO2. And for a country like ourselves, we can't, get rid of fossil fuels overnight, but we need to show a much, much greater commitment to renewable energies. And if we were anywhere else in the world with our amount of sunlight, we would have set up micro communities of solar power suburbs. And I think that's the way we need to move. I mean, I live in Kensington in Johannesburg. We've been fortunate enough to have the capital to completely retrofit our house, which runs off solar completely. Everything, all our appliances, everything. So it can easily be done. And with very simple technology, which is available in the country, we could set up these mini solar-powered suburbs. Like I know they're trying to do Parkhurst, they're trying to do Parkview, they're trying to do Kensington. You don't have to do Gauteng. You could do Vosloorus. You could do parts of Soweto. You could do Protea Glen. We've got to break the cycle of non-payment for power, supply of power, and access to power. And all of those things are tied up with each other in various companies and in people's attitudes that, they're not going to pay for coal. They must get the electricity free, but we can get the sun for free.
Yeah.
So we need to start breaking those cycles and start with small projects. You could say, we're going to have 10 residential areas in Gauteng or in the Eastern Cape or in KwaZulu-Natal become solar-powered suburbs in the next 10 years. You could do it in the next 2 years. The technology's there, the people, the technicians are there, the skills training is there. We just don't actually have a mechanism because the government makes it so difficult for people who want to be involved in small and micro enterprises around solar energy and renewable energies. It takes years to get a permit to actually set up a solar generating system.
I'm going to ask you a very quick political question on that. And I mean, the answer can be quick. Do you think that that's because of some nefarious reason from the government side? Or do you just think that there simply is such a lack of understanding of how this could radically transform not just the economy, but people's lives on the ground? What do you think is the reason for this kind of backlog that we seem to be having?
I think there's some level of, if I may use the word, corruption around this within the government. There's also a lot of inertia. So if we don't want to paint it as a completely negative picture, it's so much easier to go with what you have, even if it breaks every so often, because you think the capital investment to change it all is just far too big. So, like you and your motor car, it doesn't start every so often because the battery's flat. But I'll put up with it until I've got enough money to buy a new battery and then my car will go again. And that's exactly the mental attitude that we have to power stations. All our fossil fuel power stations, other than the 3 recently built ones, which aren't fully functional, should have all been put to sleep years ago. They're ancient. And of course, they're going to keep breaking. But we keep trying to fix them. So it's that mentality of rather making, instead of lots of little steps, making a giant leap, but supporting the giant leap with lots of little steps.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then I ask this because I think, again, it's something that's part of the conversation that's had around the climate change crisis and the economy. And it's the idea of, you know, the sort of nuclear power. And I'll gladly admit that I'm quite in the dark about the controversies around it one way or the other. But I think it's something that's topical and that people don't really understand. Is this still something that's on the table? Should it be on the table? Is it something that would, you know, sort of fix these problems? Would it be a short-term solution? What is the experts or what are experts saying about it?
I think, you know, one would have a look at it, and we do actually have a good policy around what the energy balance should be in South Africa, and when we should get to, you know, how much should be nuclear, how much should be solar, how much should be fossil fuels, but we've never implemented it. So it was very well researched. And nuclear can be efficient and cost effective if the infrastructure that you have is essentially cutting edge. So the one poor old Koeberg station that we have down in the Cape, it's like me, it's ancient, and it keeps losing its bolts and you know, slowing down. So nuclear power is very good, but it needs to be run in a system where you have extreme technical competence. Okay. So you know how and when the technology is fully functional and when it's at risk. You need to be able to sufficiently deal with the storage of the waste from nuclear power. And, you know, they always talk about it has to be stored in perpetuity. Yeah. Well, none of us know what perpetuity means. Then if you go into the European debate, they will turn around and they say they have walked away from nuclear power over the years, Germany, France, and others, because of the potential for risk and the loss of human life. Japan are walking away from it as well. So you could say it certainly has a role to play. It may have a role to play in South Africa, but if it does, then what we commit to should be done in a transparent way. And the nuclear deals are not very transparent.
Yeah, they really aren't. And I think it's just to go where you were talking about now, because France, Japan, most of the European or the Western countries that have industrialized far before us have had the benefits of using things like fossil fuels and coal to get their countries where, you know, they are at the moment. And I think a big conversation that comes up in South African politics around this issue is, and I think particularly from some people in the government, is why are we giving up our ability to do exactly what they did? Why are we having to scale back when these nations have had hundreds of years to reap the benefits? And we basically are a nation that's just starting to even get into the industrialization phase. I think, can you maybe speak to maybe the moral and the ethical obligation that we all have, regardless of where we are at the moment? Because I think that this is something that often stalls the conversation with people, because it feels unfair to us as a country that's developing to have to do and have the same obligations as, you know, developed countries that have reaped all the benefits so far.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right, and I can fully appreciate those arguments. And it's made much worse in South Africa by the legacy of apartheid. Yeah. So it's distributed, and it's skewed the distribution between the haves and the have-nots even more than versus the Northern Hemisphere versus ourselves, for example. So I can fully understand that. The issue is that we've got to try, and there are ways of doing it, putting a sustainable development pathway in place that actually has co-benefits. It will allow communities to develop and industry to develop, but not to the detriment of other things that matter, like human health, biodiversity, soil quality. And you just need, when you are thinking through interventions, and you were speaking a little bit earlier about mitigation and adaptation. So we're constantly having to mitigate, which means you've got to pull back on what you do, like stop producing carbon dioxide from power stations. But then you've got to adapt. So what have you got to start doing? And if you look in all of the global negotiations these days, and I would say in the last 5 to 10 years, a lot of the negotiation these days is structured around ethics and morality of who gets to get what, and how fair is it? You know, so 10 years ago, 15 years ago, if we went to these global negotiations with the IPCC, you would not hear the word ethics spoken once. It was just hardcore legal business, climate business, and who you are in the world, okay, in terms of a global power. Now, at least half of the agenda is ethics.
That's great.
How are we going to make this work? So, and the sort of, you know, there's nice terminology in the IPCC documentation about it being fair. That means fair for everyone, fair for the UK, fair for South Africa. How you interpret that, then I think becomes our national problem. What would be fair for South Africa? What would be equitable in South Africa? And then I think the biggest consideration, which is now becoming a very important one, is what are we doing now that is not going to negatively disadvantage future generations?
Absolutely.
And you look at I know there are probably up until now, between last year and this year, there are probably 5 or 6 Supreme Court rulings that have ruled in favor of the environment over in favor of a combination of other demands on a particular resource. So it's quite clearly people are taking Section 24 and 27 of our Constitution very seriously, to the extent that the court judgments are saying, no, guys, the environment actually really matters. And what they're meaning by that is the environment has to be able to provide a sustainable existence for the future generation.
Section 24 is incredibly important. And as I say, I just don't think that it's always at the forefront of what we put on the discussions, particularly when we're talking to citizens. And I think when people aren't aware of things, they don't really know how it affects them. And again, from some of the work that I've done in various places, I had the Ismangaliso wet park, and I had numerous ecosystems in Mkanyagute where I worked. And one of the things that really struck me was that it was such a big point of the marketability of South Africa, the sort of biodiverse area, the natural wetlands that are there, that I have a sense and a feeling that that is not something, and I certainly see it in the legislature of KZN, that is being protected. We have a wildlife board here, for example, that is constantly in disarray and is never able to function because it's changed every second year, and the people that are on it seem to disappear all the time without having done any work. But I'm interested to just move the conversation a little bit more onto the ecological side and more onto sort of our natural habitat. And again, I think it might just be important to give people an idea of, when we talk about these issues, what does that even mean? Are we talking about plants? Are we talking about planting more trees? What does that really entail when we speak about the ecological side of the global change?
Yeah, so what one really talks about, they talk about biodiversity as like a general word, okay? And biodiversity for people means it is the number of different animals, plants, humans being an animal, insects, worms, reptiles, all those sorts of things in a system. So it's the number and how they differ, but also importantly, it's not only the number and how they differ, but where in the landscape do they occur? So that's one aspect of biological diversity. Are they always found at the top of a hill, or always at the bottom of the hill, or are they always in a wetland, or are they always in a dry area like the Karoo? And then how do they function? You know, if you had 8 plants in your little garden, for example, and if you sorted the 8 out, and you planted all plant number 1 together, all plant number 2 together, all plant number 3 together, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So you have 8 little patches of plant. You wouldn't have the same ecosystem function as if they are all essentially planted together. Okay. Yeah. So when we talk about diversity, we talk about the numbers, the position in the landscape where they're found, and then the overall functionality. So when we talk about climate change, you need to always keep those 3 things in mind, because climate change can change the number of species and where they are found. Like we know wherever you live, the garden birds are changing. Everybody, regardless of whether they live in the Eastern Cape or in Limpopo province, know that the type of birds that they get in their area are now different. Other people know that certain types of plants are flowering at different times of the year and flowering earlier, okay? So the very fortunate thing about actually climate change and the way we're going to be impacted and around our biological diversity is we have excellent policy. We really have good policy. So the Environmental Management Act and everything that falls under NEMA and all the environmental acts are fantastic. And if they were complied with, we wouldn't be scared of losing a single thing. But often there's non-compliance. So that becomes a human-driven thing, which damages our biodiversity. And actually in South Africa, in many cases, it's the human-driven non-compliance that is having a much greater impact than on the biological diversity. That's true for every system, except for the succulent Karoo in the Northern Cape, where it's not really human intervention. It's not the sheep farmers and it's not the sultana farmers and the people that live out in that area. There it really is increased temperatures. So that's the biodiversity area, hotspot, that will be most impacted in terms of biodiversity loss. So we will lose species as a result of increased temperature, that we know. But in other parts of the country, the landscape pattern will change. Yeah.
What? Okay. So do you, and I mean, this might be a difficult question, but do we have a timeline on when this could happen if we don't take the interventions that are needed as soon as possible? I know that it's very hard to predict, but do we have a timeline? And I know also because of our position in South Africa and where we are in the world, that has an impact too. Maybe you could also just, expand a little bit on that.
So I think when you're talking about timelines, you really have to refer to them in terms of a timeline that we appreciate, So if you're 80 years old, you remember back 75 years of your life, so that's your timeline. If you're 5 years old, you only remember back 3 years or 2 years maybe. So timelines are dependent actually on human experience and memory. So whilst we can predict timelines for if it's the temperature is going to increase at this rate because the carbon dioxide is going up at this rate, therefore the sea is going to increase in sea level by this and by this and by this. We can do all of those calculations, and and sometimes we're wrong, like we have been very wrong on sea level rise. The sea's going up, is higher, sea level rise is much higher, at much higher rate than we thought. The glaciers are melting. The polar ice caps are melting at a much faster rate. So we kind of got those calculations wrong, but now we understand why we're getting them wrong. So if you look at that, you're talking sea level rise, those kinds of patterns, you're talking hundreds of years, okay? Maybe 500, 600, 700 years, which is beyond like a human life experiential lifespan, okay? Sure. But if you are talking changes like seasonal distribution of rainfall in South Africa, you are talking between now and the end of the century. So you're talking 80, 50, 30 years from now, okay? And so, for example, I do quite a lot of work in the forestry industry, and trees are what we call long-standing crops. You can't plant a tree today and cut it down tomorrow. Yeah. So they have a time of about 15 years. So the type of climate modeling and the impact analysis we do for the forestry industry is every 10 years between now and 2050. So there'll be certainly things that'll happen in the next 10 years. Wow. Then there'll be a lot more things that'll happen in the next 20 years, okay? And by 2050, the overall climate for temperature, particularly, and it'll be less clear for rainfall, but the temperature patterns will change. And the news that some people may like is that the nighttime temperature is getting warmer more quickly than the daytime temperature. So you'll still be able to run around barefoot until 9 or 10 o'clock at night instead of having to put your shoes on. Okay. And that means there'll also be less frost in the country. And that's so you can then grow crops in areas where, different types of fruit trees, because now you won't have frost. But the trouble is, frost is like, for example, mangoes and avocado pears and those types of tropical crops. They don't like frost. They don't like having this cold stuff on their leaves. But the benefit of having frost is that it cools the soil and it kills all the bad bugs in wintertime. So when you have frost, everything, it's like cleaning out the system, if you like. Yeah. Sprinkling some ice on it, it kills off the bad stuff. And then you can have a good clean environment the next year. But at the same time, some crops then we could grow them in wider areas. So the reduction in frost is both good and bad. So in a short answer to your question is South Africans will certainly notice the difference in the next 10 to 20 years, without a doubt. Okay.
That's my lifetime.
Yeah, around temperature, mostly, and less around rainfall. The only real, I think, cognizance, if you like, people identifying with rainfall and rainfall change will be around the two things: how bad a drought is. People remember how bad droughts are.
Yeah.
People remember how and when floods occur and have washed people away in rivers and have washed the Yukskay washes parts of Alexandra away every day or every year. But the point is, it's those what we call extreme events. So what is happening to drought in South Africa, what is happening to flood, those things will be more important than for people on the ground than just the general pattern in rainfall, which we as scientists worry about so that we can predict droughts and floods. But
that's helpful to me because, like I say, my main job is to get people to understand this and to know how it affects them so we can all take the kind of responsibility that we have to. Prof, I've got 2 questions from people who are begging me to ask you your thoughts on them just in our last sort of 10 minutes. The first question is to Professor Scholes from Zondi. What are your thoughts on energy producing bacterial biohybrids as a supplement to our energy grid?
Yeah, the technology exists, certainly, and it could be used, but only for small-scale projects. So you would have to, you know, and we spoke right in the beginning about me being a systems analyst. So you wouldn't set up a system like that was driven by a very high-tech technology unless you simultaneously set up a system where the energy that's produced can be immediately used or it can be stored. And that's always been the limitation with solar. People have said, well, we can't rely on solar because you can't store it.
Yeah.
But battery technology has moved so far in the last 5 years, storage doesn't become an issue. So any type of small-scale energy-producing systems in South Africa will work, but I don't think they'll make a major contribution to our national grid. But they would certainly provide essentially the backup for a SMME or another type of industry who are using that energy immediately for a very particular purpose. But it is high tech and therefore requires skilled maintenance.
Awesome. And then just the last question is around somebody asking about the methane that has been released from the ice caps and the feedback loops, and whether or not you could just explain what feedback loops are.
Okay, so when you talk about really big events, if you like, okay, the really big things that we have that go on in the world all the time is the way the wind blows. Okay, so if the wind is blowing from the northern hemisphere to the southern hemisphere and it goes around the equator in a particular way, if that changed, we would be in serious trouble. Okay, so that would change things like the monsoon periods and all that. It's highly unlikely. Our planet will probably die before the major global meteorology will change, okay? But what we are concerned about is what we call ocean circulation patterns, okay? And ocean circulation patterns are essentially around all of our continents, you have hot water and you have cold water.
Yeah.
And hot water and cold water flow differently around the subcontinents, okay, and up into the northern hemisphere and back into the southern hemisphere. And the big word is called the thermohaline circulation. So what's the temperature? What's the temperature of the water? And how salty is it? And those two things control essentially where all the different currents of the world go. So, you know, in the Indian Ocean, we have the Indian Ocean current that's controlled by how salty it is, and it's a warm current. Whereas off the Cape Coast, we have the Agulhas current and the Benguela currents. Okay, those are cold ocean currents. So they flow up and down at different levels. When you melt ice caps are fresh water. They're not salt water, okay? So when you're melting the North Pole and when you're melting the South Pole, you're adding fresh water into a salty environment. So you can just think about it. You've got a pot of boiling water on the stove and you put in 1 teaspoon of salt. Now you take that pot and you make it 3 times the size by adding more fresh water to it. You're going to completely change how quickly that pot of water is going to boil or how quickly it's going to stay cold. Okay, so the way that these big ocean currents rush around the world is dependent on temperature and salinity. Okay, you melt the ice caps, you put more fresh water into the system, and you can have either what they call feedback loops, or you can have choking events. So a feedback loop, is quite simple. It's quite simply explained like, you absolutely love chocolate, so I'm going to eat more chocolate, and the feedback on that is you're going to get fat. Okay. The negative feedback on that is it's much harder to get thin again than it was to put on that weight. Okay, that's a feedback loop. That they operate at different speeds and they have different impacts. And you get lots of feedback loops. If someone comes and pushes you off your chair now, nothing is going to happen. But if you were tied to the person next door by a piece of string and someone pushes you off your chair, the person next door is also going to fall off their chair. So that's what a feedback loop is. One thing has an impact on another thing, which can then impact either negatively or positively back on you. So the melting of the ice caps has these feedback loops because you're getting the water in different salt concentrations crashing into each other. And that controls things like what's called the Gulf Stream. The Gulf Stream is a very important current that flows through the Gulf of Mexico, and it decides then which bit of North America is going to stay warm for how long, and which bit of the North Sea, which then flows up past the UK, is going to stay cold. So if the Gulf Stream chokes and it stops flowing in its normal pattern for a while, might be a week, might be 10 months, then you get very different impacts in different parts of the world. So a current in the Gulf Stream is, and the way it's changing, is now influencing the Arctic Circle. So that's how this big thermohaline circulation works. It's all the water molecules in the sea that are all connected to each other, and they all flow around together depending on the temperature and the salt concentration.
Wow, thank you. We've only got about 5 minutes. Wow, you're going to
stay awake at night tonight. Yeah? You'll be so worried about this.
I really am, and I have a 17-month-old daughter, and I'm really scared for what the world is going to look like. As you say, if some of these things are going to be happening in my lifetime, I can only imagine what the world is going to look like in her lifetime if we don't arrest the decline of the environmental crisis, or arrest the environmental crisis that we have. And I mean, we just have 5 minutes left, but I think it's just important, firstly, for me to say to delegates that I have written an op-ed about how we don't need any more day zeros in our country that I'll be posting here, as well as my plan on the climate change. But I really thought it was important to have Professor Scholes come and explain some of these really difficult concepts in a way that is easy, because ultimately what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to go out and speak to the public and speak to people who care about their environment, who care about their habitats, and explain to them why they need to vote for the Democratic Alliance if we can put this as part of the agenda and part of our platform that we take seriously. But Professor Scholes, do you have anything to just say generally about the crisis of Africa, or what you think politicians should be doing, or if we're doing enough? How would you rate our governments, just before we end, and then I'll want to thank you properly.
Thank you. So just very quickly, maybe we can set up another slot sometime to talk about water. We've spoken a lot about energy today. Water is going to be our biggest crisis, and soon. Within 5 to 10 years, we're going to have a water crisis in the country. So it's around the quality, mostly, of potable water, and how we can look at that in South Africa. So in terms of, government policy, even though I said earlier we've got good policy, in fact, many of our policies don't really need to be changed. They need to be complied with by the state organ, be it a subnational or national or municipality, that actually needs to understand why they're complying with something and not just tick the box, because the box has to be ticked. And unfortunately, both for especially the water situation in the country, that is a big tick box approach at the moment, and that is not going to get us down the road at all. And so is the energy. So instead of necessarily thinking about changing big policy, which we can do, that would involve actually looking at what the system would best support, both in terms of current generation and the future generation, which we spoke about. So small changes in order to ensure compliance would be low-hanging fruits, so that we could do that whilst we were waiting for big mega changes in policy around, we are going to phase out CO2 power stations in the next 10 years or 15 years.
Yeah. And I mean, we also have to be realistic about some of these goals. And water is certainly part of my plan. I suppose I assume that because we all see it as being such an immediate threat, that people understand the water crisis probably more than the other issues that we spoke about. Certainly water, and I'm from KZN, and we have areas that have gone without water for years, and municipalities that haven't been able to do the basic functions of service delivery that could be helping in those situations. So we really do have a lot of work, and I think you're speaking about compliance and the ability to even make the people who are supposed to do these things understand why it's important is again something that should be part of what I use and what anyone who's got a platform uses to get this happening. So I wanted to thank you so much, Professor Scholes. This has been a fascinating conversation. There are people that have been watching on Facebook, and I see that we've got people on Twitter also talking about how this is one of that South Africa is joint second in the world whose digital citizens take climate change seriously. So I'm really happy that you were able to give all those people and share your knowledge with us on these matters. It's really important, and I think just having people like you makes me so happy that there are people in the country that are looking out for this. And I'll certainly be using any sort of platform that I have to try and help you in your work and to advance some of the good research that you and your husband are doing. So I really think that you are a national treasure. I think that anyone who's working in this field is doing it.
That sounds like you're going to put me in a museum soon.
No, not at all. We need you doing your systems analysis. So thank you so much again. I'll obviously be reaching out to you more importantly, and I'll be sending you my plan so you can have a look at it too. And I hope that everyone who's been watching, particularly delegates to the Congress, understand how serious this issue is, and that as we go into our policy conference and our federal Congress, that we can resolve to put this as something that's really at the forefront of many of the issues that we're going to be talking about, but many of the issues that the party needs to champion. Thanks so much for joining us, everyone.
Good, bye. Thanks. Good luck with your campaign.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.